On June 23, 1985, a routine Air India flight from Toronto to New Delhi carrying 329 people exploded over the Atlantic Ocean. What would follow was one of the most extensive investigations in aviation history. But this wasn't just a tragic accident. This was a chilling terror plot, and it was part of a story with roots stretching back to decades and spanning continents. The current tensions between India and Canada is just another chapter in this old terror plot. This is Shakuntala Sharma, a high school vice principal in India. She took her first vacation in 40 years to visit her daughters, Usha and Uma, in Canada. Shakuntala had been separated from her husband since 1947 due to his imprisonment during the partition of India and Pakistan. A highly educated woman, she raised her 5 daughters alone. In 1985, she was returning with her daughter Uma and 2 granddaughters. Tragically, they all lost their lives aboard Air India Flight 182, marking a devastating incident that took the lives of 4 women from the same family across 3 generations. But what really led to this devastating tragedy? Watch this full video to uncover every detail of this conspiracy. The story of Air India Flight 182 is more than just a tale of terror. It's a story of a political movement, religious identity, and unhealed scars from a nation divided. To understand what led to this devastating event, we need to go back in time to understand a movement that gripped a community and drove its most extreme followers to violence. The Khalistan movement. This is Punjab, a region known for its rich culture and traditions. This is the home to the majority of India's Sikh population. But beneath the vibrant culture, tension was simmering even from the pre-independence days. Since the 1970s, many Sikhs felt increasingly marginalized and alienated by the Indian government, with complaints ranging from lack of representation to economic disadvantages and concerns over cultural and religious preservations of Sikhs. This sentiment gave birth to what we know as the Khalistan movement, a political and religious campaign seeking a separate Sikh state called Khalistan. Some Sikhs believed this new state could protect their rights and traditions in a way that India couldn't or hadn't. The demand for a separate Sikh state traces back to the 1930s when British colonial rule in India was approaching its end. The idea gained traction over the decades, particularly with support, both financial and political, from the Sikh diaspora. By the 1970s and early 80s, this call for independence had transformed into an active separatist movement in the Indian state of Punjab, where Sikhs formed the majority of the population. During this period, insurgency intensified, leading to widespread unrest and violent clashes as separatists sought to carve out an independent Sikh homeland within Indian territory. Among the movement's most vocal leaders was Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, a charismatic man who tapped directly into the grievances felt by Sikhs in Punjab. He openly criticized the Indian government, calling for greater autonomy for Punjab and representing the frustrations shared by many in the state. As Bhindranwale's influence grew, so did communal tensions. Eventually, he established what many described as a parallel government in Punjab. The Golden Temple in Amritsar, a site sacred to every Sikh, served as his base of operations. Bhindranwale and his followers began stockpiling weapons, transforming the temple into a fortified stronghold in preparation for a direct confrontation with the Indian government. By 1984, the Indian government feared that this movement could spiral into an uncontrollable civil war. Prime Minister Mrs. Indira Gandhi made a brazen and controversial decision. She ordered Operation Blue Star, a military raid on the Golden Temple to capture Bhindranwale and his supporters. What happened next shocked the entire Sikh community and left deep wounds. The Indian army, using heavy firepower and even tanks, engaged in a brutal assault. By the end, Bhindranwale and his men were dead, but so were hundreds of innocent Sikh pilgrims caught in the crossfire. one of Sikhism's holiest sites had become a horrid battleground. For many Sikhs, this was an unforgivable act, a violation of their faith and culture. The event ignited outrage, and in October 1984, this led to Indira Gandhi's assassination by her own Sikh bodyguards. What followed next was a wave of organized anti-Sikh pogroms across the nation that took thousands of lives and further deepened the divide. The government allegedly destroyed evidence and shielded the guilty. In Delhi's Tilak Vihar, thousands of families affected by the 1984 anti-Sikh massacre found shelter in what is now known as the Widow Colony. Many Sikh widows there still await closure, haunted by the memory of over 4,000 Sikhs killed in the national capital. Decades later, justice remains out of reach. Meanwhile, the Khalistani movement found new ground abroad. Sikhs in Canada and other countries rallied for the cause of Khalistan, and some fringe and radical groups, outraged and grief-stricken, sought retribution through violence. And it is in this volatile environment that the seeds were sown for a terror plot that would lead to the Air India bombing. So what happened on that fateful day? It was June 22nd, 1985, a day before the incident. A man calling himself Manjeet Singh steps into the bustling Vancouver airport. He is calm, focused, and he is carrying a dark brown Samsonite suitcase. He checks the bag, insisting it to be transferred onto Air India Flight 182, bound for India, which is leaving Montreal the following day. But there is only one problem. His ticket isn't confirmed. The airline agent hesitates, but eventually relents. The suitcase is now on its way. But what about Manjeet Singh? He is nowhere to be seen again. What nobody knew at that moment, that this was the bag that held the bomb. In less than 24 hours, it would go off, killing all 329 people on board Air India Flight 182. Manjeet Singh's suitcase travels across Canada, arriving at Toronto's Pearson International Airport. Air India requests additional security, fearing exactly this kind of attack. The baggage is X-rayed, hand-checked, but then the X-ray machine malfunctions. Instead, officials resort to a portable explosive sniffer. It beeps faintly on a maroon suitcase but doesn't raise alarm. The suitcase continues its journey, loaded onto Flight 182. The aircraft operating the flight was a Boeing 747-237B named after Emperor Kanishka. At midnight, the Boeing takes off from Toronto to Montreal and then leaves Montreal for Heathrow Airport in London. It has 329 passengers on board, many families, students, parents and children simply heading home or visiting loved ones. The plane reaches its cruising altitude, flying over the Atlantic with nothing but open seas below. At 8:14 a.m. Irish time, something happens. A bomb hidden in a radio tuner inside that suitcase explodes, ripping through the aircraft. The plane disintegrates in seconds, plunging into the depths of the Atlantic. There was no mayday, no warning. The pilots were last heard talking about buying from duty-free shops in London, and then silence. By the time rescue teams arrived, all that is left is debris, some personal items, bits of luggage, and shattered memories. The bomb killed all 22 crew members and 307 passengers on board. Of those, only 132 bodies were recovered. The rest 197 were lost forever at sea. All the physical evidence was forever lost 7,000 feet below the ocean surface. 329 lives lost that fateful day. Among them, 80 were under 12 years old. It was the deadliest act of aviation terror until 9/11, and it happened quietly, devastatingly. But how could this happen? Who was the mastermind? The answer lay in a web of political and religious tensions, a handful of radicalized figures, and a bomb that slipped through cracks in the security system. Within hours of the explosion, all eyes turned to Canada's Indian community as authorities probed possible connections to Sikh separatist groups known for threats and violent acts of retaliation. While no bomb fragments surfaced from the ocean, the investigation uncovered that the explosive had been hidden in a Sanyo stereo tuner, part of a batch shipped to Vancouver. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, assigned 135 officers to track every store selling Sanyo tuners. The investigation ultimately led them to a mechanic in Duncan, British Columbia, called Inderjeet Singh Rayat. Rayat was already under surveillance by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS, and was linked to someone named Talvinder Singh Parmar. Parmar was a prominent and radicalized figure in the militant Babbar Khalsa group and was flagged as a high-risk individual by the Canadian Intelligence Service. Parmar had approached Rayat months before to build a timer bomb, claiming it was for a cause. Rayat, who claimed not to know the purpose of the bomb, sourced parts from various local shops and assembled it in his garage. While CSIS had already been tracking Parmar, the alleged mastermind, they missed several crucial red flags leading up to the disaster. Talvinder Singh Parmar and Inderjeet Singh Rayat were arrested following the investigation. Rayat was convicted but only on weapons charges, while all charges against Parmar were soon dropped for lack of evidence. Years later, in a major development, RCMP arrested Ripudaman Singh Malik, a Vancouver-based businessman, and Ajay Singh Bagri, a mill worker from Kamloops, linking them to the Air India bombing. But after a lengthy trial, both men were acquitted. The evidence was simply not strong enough to convict them. In the end, Rayat would be the only individual convicted in connection with the bombing, and even that conviction was limited. In 1992, News from India revealed that Parmar had died in a police gunfight in Bombay. Years later, reports suggested that Indian authorities may have held Parmar in custody before his death and interrogated him about his role in the Air India bombing. However, no Sikh community members we spoke to supported this heinous act of terror. In fact, many believe that the bombing may have been orchestrated by the Indian government. A persistent claim holds that India's Toronto consul allegedly advised family and friends to avoid the flight before departure. The Council of Khalistan even raised these suspicions in this letter to Canada's Justice Minister. Yet, to date, there is no concrete evidence supporting these conspiracy theories. And so, despite the extensive investigation, justice for the victims of Flight 182 remains incomplete, a haunting reminder of a complex and tragic chapter in modern history. The New York Times reported in 2005, the case was a saga that stretched from Canada to England to India, including a Sikh liberation struggle that is now largely forgotten, the murders of several journalists, and inexplicable mistakes by the Canadian police and intelligence agents. 39 years later, the tragedy of Air India Flight 182 remains an open wound. It is a haunting reminder of lives lost, families shattered, and unresolved grief. But you know what's the most chilling part is? The story doesn't end there. This dark chapter is far from closed, and we are still living in its shadow.